Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Elizabeth Wetmore to discuss Valentine, a fierce, unflinching, and surprisingly tender novel that illuminates women's strengths and vulnerabilities and reminds us that it is the stories we tell ourselves that keep us alive. Elizabeth Wetmore is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. Her fiction has appeared in Epoch, Kenyon Review, Colorado Review, and many other literary journals. She is the recipient of a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts and 2 fellowships from the Illinois Arts Council, as well as a grant from the Barbara Deming Foundation. A native of West Texas, she lives and works in Chicago. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by Ron Charles. Ron writes about books for the Washington Post, and that's all he wanted us to say about him. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Valentine from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Here we go. Hi, Beth. Welcome.
Hi.
Okay.
Hello. Thank you so much for being here. I have wanted to talk to you since I read your book and loved your book last year.
It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so happy to be with y'all tonight.
This is really fun. It's been so exciting to see Valentine win such praise and find such a large and growing audience. And having your first novel critically acclaimed and be a bestseller, I mean, that's exciting and that's wonderful at any time. But what has it been like for that to happen during a worldwide pandemic for you?
Yeah, well, you know, I can have a tendency towards sort of catastrophic thinking. And so of all the things that could possibly have gone wrong with the book launch, that I might have inadvertently plagiarized, or, you know, that I forgot to give credit somewhere, or I mean, anything, you know, a screw up at the printer, whatever, you know, a global pandemic never crossed my mind. So, but, you know, but I'll be honest with you. I mean, I had so much help with the book launch, and we adapted very quickly, and I feel incredibly lucky. And also, you know, you become very aware very quickly that there are much larger things going on.
Yes, true. I think it's wonderful the way bookstores like Books and Books have responded, you know, been very flexible, and authors like you have made yourselves available for things like this. And those of you watching, please do support this bookstore and the work they're doing. These kind of things are free to you, but they're not free to the bookstore, and bookstores need your help. Elizabeth, I understand there are some people in the audience you might want to welcome and thank.
Yes, there are. So first of all, everyone who's here, thank you. I want to say thanks to you, Ron, of course, but also to all the staff at Books and Books and Christina, who put this together and keeping our tech running smoothly for us. I'm in Miami from time to time to visit family, and I've been really grateful for your locations in Coral Gables and also at the Miami airport. So my family, my in-laws, Carrie and George Sanchez, are watching tonight. And I've talked quite a bit in other situations about the enormous amount of help I had during the years when I was writing Valentine, and NEA that paid for childcare for my son, some writing residencies, of course, the love and faith of friends and family, practical support. Back in 2008, when our son was 3 years old, and without really thinking about how exactly my husband and I were going to pull it off, I applied to and was given a 4-week residency at the McDowell Colony. And at that time, our son was 3. My husband was working 2 or 3 teaching jobs. And so we were all over the place. It was all hands on deck every day to make everything happen. I was freelancing. But my mother-in-law, Carrie, cashed in a big chunk of her vacation time and came to Chicago and helped my husband take care of our son so that I could go to this residency. And it was during that residency that I was able to finish up a first draft of the book. So it's no understatement to say that Valentine would not exist without Carrie's help. And I'm deeply grateful. George, Carrie, I'm glad you're here tonight. We all miss y'all terribly, and we can't wait to see you. So
that's great. That's great. And it's nice to be reminded that although a novel is the work of one person, it depends on so many other people along the way. You've written that rare thing, an incredibly exciting thriller that is also gorgeously written and profoundly thoughtful about some of the most pressing issues of our era. And so I have to ask, how did you get to this point? How did this book come to be? I mean, did this novel come to you fully blown when you woke up from a dream one morning, or was it the work of many years?
Yeah, nothing ever comes to me fully blown. And if it does, it was probably a really bad idea. One thing I've learned about myself as a writer is that my first instincts are rarely good, nor are my second or third. I revise constantly. So no, I mean, I worked on the book for about 14 years. And so the world changed as I was working on it, of course. And I changed, but I really had no idea at all. I really began with a sort of assortment of voices that I remembered listening to as a little girl, the voices of the women and girls that I was sort of surrounded by when I was a little girl growing up in Odessa. And really that was the genesis of the book, were those voices that had always come along with me after I left home and went out into the wide world. And so, I began with those voices, and then, imagination kicked in pretty quickly. So.
Wow. Well, I'm sure there are people listening who've read the book and loved it, but there are also people watching us who have not read the book. And so we're both going to be careful and those of you that ask questions later, let's be careful that we don't spoil the suspense of the plot as we talk. All right. So this is a book about the rape of a Mexican girl by a well-connected white man. But in fact, it's really about the way an oil town, Odessa, Texas, reacts to that crime. And that setting is so real in these pages. And I want you to talk more about how you know this place and how you brought it alive with such fidelity on the page.
Well, thanks for saying that. You hope you have fidelity to the place and the time and the characters. I grew up there. And so when I began the book, I actually thought this was going to be a piece of cake. I thought, wow, I can write about this place. I was born and raised there. Practically every man in my family, has worked in the oil patch at one time or another. That was not the case, as it turned out. It turned out that I knew very little about my hometown. As a little girl growing up in a deeply segregated community, there was a whole lot going on that I didn't know anything about. So when I realized that I needed to kind of relearn the place that I was from, I spent a lot of time reading about the history. I spent a lot of time going back to visit family and going downtown and looking through old newspapers. And I spent a lot of time just driving around out in the desert, honestly, and sort of trying to fall back in love with that land. When I left, like a lot of people who leave their hometowns, I wanted, I was going to go back for Christmas, and that was it, and I understood that I couldn't write this book if I didn't have a real affection, a genuine affection and open heart for the place and the characters. And so, it took me a while to get there, honestly. And that's not on the place or the people, that's on the writer for just not maybe being mature enough and large enough of spirit at first, to really do justice to the work.
It is a very loving portrayal of some of the people, and it's a pretty brutal portrayal of other people. Have you gotten feedback from the town or people that live there? How are they reacting to this portrayal of them and their place?
Yeah, I was a little anxious. I mean, first of all, I still have family living there, including my beloved sister, who is married to a cattle rancher. So, I was a little anxious about how it would land. And the book pulls no punches in many ways. But I also tried always to write with an ethic of care and respect. And I hope that I pulled that off. Honestly, the the feedback I've gotten from people in my hometown has been great.
Excellent.
Honestly. Yeah, like across the board. If anyone's got something bad to say, they're keeping it to themselves, or I just haven't seen it. But I heard from a lot of readers, and I heard in particular, I heard from a lot of women who were so delighted to see these women and girls on the page, you know, and to see a kind of a little bit of a light being shown on that part of the world. So,
Definitely.
yeah.
In many ways, Odessa, Texas is a small, out of the way place. It's not San Francisco. It's not New York. It's not Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
But you make a strong case that this is an essentially American place that we need to pay attention to.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is that, you know, when you don't pay attention to a place, a lot can happen there. And, you know, when you don't have regulations, you know, for example, you know, and people keeping an eye on a place, you know, all kinds of, frankly, bad stuff can happen. You know, West Texas and the Permian Basin has been, you know, about 110-year-old sort of slow rolling environmental disaster. And that affects all of us, especially right now in the midst of the climate crisis. But for whatever effects it has on the rest of the world, you know, our economy, our climate, no one is affected more deeply by the oil and gas industry than the people who live right there, you know, in Odessa, where the entire economy depends on oil and gas, you know, and yet, you know, you have cancer rates that are much higher than the national average. I was just reading an article in the Texas Observer about the thousands of uncapped wells that are leaking methane gas out there, because when the price of oil collapses, the oil companies just walk away. No one's watching them, right? And this article actually made the argument that as much as 20% of our methane gas in the U.S. could be coming from just these uncapped wells, which is an expensive process to cap them, but actually would create a ton of jobs, you know. So you know, I wanted to call attention to that part of the world, and I also wanted to call attention to characters who were, you know, working class women and girls without a lot of resources. A lot of, you know, several of my characters didn't graduate from high school. You know, they have a lot of money, they're a lot of power, you know, and yet they're, you know, the nobility of the spirit, right? They persevere.
Yeah. Can you read a passage to us just to give us a flavor of the prose?
Sure. I think I'll read a little bit of Corinne Shepard's chapter. This is her last chapter, and I think I can just read this without really setting it up or giving anything away. What I will say is that Corinne is driving down the highway following her neighbor, Mary Rose Whitehead, and they're both chasing after a neighborhood girl who's gotten in the truck with a young man. The reader knows that the little girl is fine at this point, but the characters do not. So Corinne Shepard is an unrepentant leadfoot, accustomed to going at least 20 miles over the speed limit, even when she's in no particular hurry. Now she drives down the I-20 like death itself is chasing her. The speedometer's needle trembles between 80 and 85 miles an hour, but Mary Rose's white sedan is moving faster, and the distance between the two cars grows until the younger woman is at least a half mile ahead. With the storm moving south at 10 miles an hour, the women drive into a cloud of red dirt and bone-colored caliche dust. As they approach Pinwell, the wind turns fierce and Corinne's car begins to shake. The motion roils her stomach, reminding her that she has not eaten today, that she is thirsty, that she drank too much last night and every night since Potter died, that she is an old woman completely unprepared to stop the world from coming apart at the seams. When they were standing in Corinne's driveway and Mary Rose spat out that word, bastard, her voice was flat as the land Corinne is looking at now, and her heart fell to her feet. She has heard this tone of voice a few times in her life, usually, but not always, from a man or group of men. And although Mary Rose is angry and afraid, and there's a little girl driving around with a man they don't know, it occurs to Corinne why Mary Rose's tone of voice sounds so familiar. It is not the ginned-up, high-pitched rage you hear when a crowd burns a book or throws a rock through a window or plants a soaked cross in somebody's yard and sets it ablaze. The flatness of Mary Rose's speech, the hollow affect, the cold and steady tone of voice, all are fear and rage transformed into wrath. Hers is the voice of someone whose mind is made up. All that's left to do is wait for the little spark that will justify about what is about to happen next. All her life, Corinne has watched this poison move through her students and their parents, through men sitting at the bar or in the bleachers, through churchgoers and neighbors and the town's fathers and mothers. She has watched her own kith and kin pour this poison into their best glassware, spoon it onto the plates and bowls their ancestors hauled in wagons from Georgia and Alabama, all while proclaiming that they worked for everything they ever got and nobody ever gave them nothing. They earned it, living and dying in that refinery and those fields. And they can't do a goddamn thing about the people who control the purse strings and hand over their paychecks, who can put them out of work with a wink and a nod, but they sure can point a finger at somebody else. If they say it long enough, in enough different ways, they might stop seeing the child of God standing on the other side of those words or buckling under the awful weight of them. Whatever gets you through the night or helps you turn your back so you can keep up the lie. Whatever lets you light the match or throw the rope over a strong branch and still be home in time for dinner and the football game. And while Mary Rose maybe has better reason than most of these fools and sinners to open the door for unbridled wrath, Corinne also knows this. One way or another, it will eventually kill you. But goddamn, you can do some damage on your way out the door. I'll stop there.
That is great. And it's such a great example of what you do so well. I mean, that's a car chase, folks. And look how it immediately veers off into a discussion of really major, profound issues. So you've got the action and this deep cultural searching voice. I think it's really remarkable. This is a novel about the ways women, particularly women without much education or money, negotiate a culture of masculine brutality. And at the center of this is Mary Rose Whitehead, right? The protagonist of Valentine. She's brave and she's principled and she's increasingly terrified by what she realizes about the way the world works. And her journey, her ethical journey, feels totally real and specific, but it also feels very universal. I wonder if you can talk about her and her gradual realization of the kind of place she lives in.
Yeah. Well, it is it's both gradual and not gradual. What I was interested in Mary Rose was the way her conscience is shocked, right, by the appearance of this child on her doorstep who survived this brutal attack and who is very much a child, and her sort of slow and so her conscience is shocked, and that really is kind of a swift kick to the head, in the opening pages of the book. But then as the story unfolds and she sees the blowback from her neighbors and friends, I think then her journey sort of comes into sharper focus even for her. And one of the things that interested me about Mary Rose Whitehead too is her enormous rage. She's enormously angry in this book. She's 26 years old. She's got a 9-year-old daughter. She left high school when she got pregnant, right? She's got another child on the way. This, in a lot of ways, I think this moment of seeing this young stranger on our doors not only shocks the conscience, but sort of brings into focus some of her own anger about some of her sort of options and sort of where she's found herself, in the community. So I loved her as a character, but I also found her to be deeply flawed. I mean, on the one hand, it's easy to say, well, she opened the door and took the stranger in and then got her gun, right? I don't want to give too much away, but on the other hand, I mean, she's never really able to see glory, in her sort of fullness as another character. And to me, that seemed accurate to the time and the place and the deep, the xenophobia and racism that's really stitched into the fabric of that part of the world, so. Right.
There are a full range of men in this book, but it is a novel in which the women hold center stage, young and old. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I was following stories about women. I didn't know how they related to the main subject of the plot, but then mm-hmm. of course it does in a very fascinating way. How do you map out a bunch of characters like that in your mind or in your planning?
Well, I always, and when I'm working on a book, I almost always have big butcher blocks of paper up on the wall, and I
Right.
will use those. I'll use little note cards and sort of pin them up to keep my thoughts organized. But again, I worked on the book for a very long time, so I spent a lot of time with these characters and really got to know them and understand them. And of course they, I think sometimes, once you get caught up in the process, the characters will kind of lead you, right? You put them in place, you try to get a sense of who they are, and then you sort of set them loose on the page and hope that they will behave in ways that make sense, right? so, I mean, it sounds a little crazy to say I listen to the voices in my head. What's the thing that I think Faulkner said it like, some people listen to the voices in their heads and they're called mad and shut up in institutions. Other people listen to the voices in their head and call them fiction writers. Or, I mean, I'm paraphrasing badly, but
That's it. Yeah. And I hear this from enough authors that I believe it, but it still does sound a bit mad.
Yeah.
A very serious subject. Novels about sexual violence against women confront a really complicated conundrum. To the extent the novelist plays up that violence for dramatic effect, they risk participating in a culture that exploits women and their suffering for drama, for entertainment.
Right.
I love the complex, sensitive way that you confront that artistic and moral problem in Valentine. I know you thought about it for years. Can you tell us how you thought through that?
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, the two biggest decisions I made early were, and the two decisions I really grappled with the longest were why you would do this, why you would start a book, in the aftermath of an assault, and what my motivation for doing so was. And then the second question was why make this happen to a young Mexican American girl? Why not have it happen to one of the white characters, in the book? And I really wrestled with it. In fact, so much that I actually wrote, I rewrote some of the early chapters and made the character white, and it just didn't work. A couple of things sort of played into my decision. Sadly, one of them was that as I began doing research on the book, I came to realize very quickly how ubiquitous sexual assault is in an oil and gas town, particularly during an oil boom. And that's not specific to West Texas. It's, you see this in North Dakota actually right now, and in recent years, just how ubiquitous it is. And also the other thing that became apparent to me was, how it was so much worse for women and girls of color, and that was something that I had no awareness of at all, as a young woman as a girl growing up there. So I chose it in part because it's unfortunately so common. And then I think my other motivation was that I understood very early that I could not write this book without at least attempting to grapple with the racism that I saw growing up there,
Right.
as best as I was able. And so, I wanted to put Glory front and center. In a lot of ways, I actually consider her to be the most important character in the book, although she doesn't get as much page time. And this may sound kind of goofy, but she doesn't get as much page time as the other characters. And after those opening chapters, she never crosses paths with the white women ever again in this book. And to me, that seemed very realistic to the time and place. I never wanted to put her and Mary Rose, in a scene together after that, because it made sense to me that, that given the time and the place, that their paths wouldn't cross again. And I wanted to be very careful, frankly, not to let the white women swoop in and save her, so I intentionally kept the Glory's story sort of separate from all the other characters. And I tried to give her some of the most beautiful writing in the book, which may not sound like a big thing, but to me is pretty important. So yeah. I'm always, hoping to make things both beautiful and useful.
Right. Now, Valentine coincidentally came out during a very important and very contentious debate about the way white writers portray people of color, the way they imagine their lives, about the accuracy. That debate became as I said, very, very contentious. It must have it must have concerned you in the years you were working on the book and as the book came out too. How did you make sure that you were being respectful, that you weren't being condescending, that you were getting things right, that you were, doing justice to another culture?
Well, in a lot of ways, I don't know that I did, right? I mean, and that's part of it, right? You do your best and then you put the work out into the world and you hope for the best and you remind yourself that if you're not willing to take risk, you probably have no business writing fiction. But that being said, I did try to, I tried to do my due diligence. I tried to do research. I tried to ask questions, of friends and acquaintances who had more experience in communities like Glory's. I had a very dear friend who grew up in Andrews. His mom and dad were migrant workers who came from Chihuahua. Actually, they actually weren't migrant workers. They actually owned land, quite a bit of land in Chihuahua, and they gave up all their land to migrate to the United States. So he was first generation, and I asked him for some advice. I did some reading. And I tried to interrogate every decision, and I had an amazing editor actually who, Emily Griffin at Harper, sure. who really, who checked in with me from time to time and had a conversation with me about my motivation for doing some things. And there were some lines that were stricken and rightly so. And so I tried to do my best and keep an open heart, and at the end of the day, hope that I had the wisdom to be quiet and listen if anyone had any criticism.
Right. That's all you can do.
Yeah. But I balk at the idea that there are certain stories that aren't people's to tell. I never want to underestimate the power of imagination and empathy, so.
Right. I think that's it, is just being aware, being humble, listening.
Yeah.
Those are the
humility is, I think, I would like to see the word humility used in writers' circles so much more frequently than it is. I think, I think it would be just something to always aspire to when you sit down to your work, to approach it with an air of humility. So.
Well, thank you for that very sincere and thoughtful response to a really tough question.
Yeah.
Some of these chapters read like short stories, and I mean that in the best possible way. They could stand alone, but they're perfectly integrated into the novel. Does that have anything to do with the way you write, with your interest in short stories, with your conception of this novel?
Yes, to all of that. Actually, well, initially I thought it might be a collection of short stories, and then and I realized in short order that there were some ideas that I wanted to explore across the sort of trajectory of the book. I wanted to really meditate on mercy, and compassion and forgiveness. And not just, the importance of receiving forgiveness, but the importance of asking for forgiveness and doing the work needed to get that forgiveness, right? So these were all things that, so it became clear to me that a novel was probably the right structure. But yes, I'm far more comfortable with the short story. I have much more experience writing short stories. And also I like the kind of contained nature of chapters, I don't tie things up, I don't generally tie things up neatly at the end of anything. I think you see that all over this book, a lot of unanswered questions, which I very much intended. So yeah.
And it gave you space or freedom to experiment formally. I don't know how much we can give away, but there are some chapters in this book that are not like the others. Maybe you could describe one of the, I don't want to say odder, but one of the more experimental or different chapters.
There's a chapter very late in the book, and it's this character only gets one chapter from her point of view. There are three characters who only get one chapter from their point of view. And there's a chapter very late in the book from the point of view of a 17-year-old waitress named Carla, who's also a new mom.
That's the one I'm thinking of.
Yeah, and interspersed throughout the chapter are these sort of local sort of jokes. They're jokes, but they're not that funny, many of them. And so I think like the first one is something like, "Why did God give oil to West Texas? To make up for what He did to the land?" And so I've interspersed these jokes in there, and then I'm also moving back and forth between Carla's point of view, which is in third person, and then a first person plural point of view of the waitresses she works with. And so it's, I'm sort of weaving all of these things together in this single chapter. It was a hard chapter. Actually, I came very close to cutting it.
No, it's a real tour de force.
I adore it. I adore that chapter, and I adore her. And I think I mentioned to you earlier when we were doing our tech check, I waited tables for a grand total of like 12 years of my adult life. So I'm kind of determined to have a restaurant or a wait staff in pretty much everything I do. First of all, it's such a rich environment for stories, but it also got to some of the more serious things I was interested in, which was, how these women of very limited means are able to look out for one another, and take care of each other and keep each other safe in a restaurant where they're harassed daily, right? So.
Right. In the most casual way. It's it's so normalized. Meg Willits wrote a great essay a few years ago about women's fiction and the way novels about men are not called men's fiction. And she sort of deconstructed that whole term. There's nothing polemic about your novel, but it is a novel about women, and it does reply to a whole shelf, maybe a whole library of books about men, particularly thrillers about men. And I wondered if you thought of yourself in that position as you were writing, because the men all seem on the periphery of this plot. Even the criminal at the center of the plot is sort of pushed off to the side.
I'm embarrassed to admit that it wasn't always that way. When for many, many drafts, I had several chapters from the points of view of several men. Potter Shepard had his own point of view. Jesse Belgian had his own point of view, which broke my heart to cut because it was an absolutely beautiful chapter. Just so beautifully written. I was so proud of it, but it didn't work. And part of that was, it was hard for me at first and for many drafts to imagine writing a book set in that part of the world without having men's points of view, because the economy was very important to me, and it's such a male-dominated industry. Even there just aren't a lot of women and girls who work in the oil patch, certainly not as roughnecks, which is the aspect of it that I'm interested in. So I didn't always just have women and girls. I kind of slowly wrote the men out, and some of them became some really beautiful short stories. But I did reach the moment where I understood that it really mattered to me to hand this book over to these women and girls, in its entirety.
That's fascinating. I'm so surprised and delighted by that. And I hope we'll get to see those stories, off somewhere on their own or in a collection.
Well, one of them is out in the Iowa Review. It's called Shelter in Place, and it's actually from the point of view of John Ledbetter, the young man who is in a scene with Corrine Shepard, kind of latish in the book. So that one's out, and I'm hoping to kind of get some of the others out in the world as well. So 14 years, you screw around a lot when you work on a book for 14 years. I've done a lot of different paths, and for me, that's actually, you asked earlier if I knew the story, and not only did I not know the story, but I never know the story. I have to figure out every single thing in the process, which means I end up going down a lot of rabbit holes and having to back up. So.
Wow. Well, we're going to take questions in a minute. So there's a little button down here, people, called Ask a Question. If you click that, a box pops up and you can type them in there, and we'll get to them in just a minute. So I know there are some writers in the crowd here watching. What advice, do you have for somebody who's toiling away? And I mean, you must have to deal with discouragement and lack of inspiration and feeling like this will never happen, or, what can you give some encouraging, practical advice?
Yeah, I hope so. I will tell you this. I can tell you what the worst writing advice I ever heard was, and I won't say who it was. But when I was in grad school, a male writer, said to us, if you don't write every day, you can't call yourself a writer.
I hear that all the time.
Yep. And for a writer like me, a working class writer who was always, with the exception of the 2 years at grad school, I was always working other jobs. I was raising my son, being a friend, always sort of squeezing my writing in around the practicalities of life, and that was a devastating thing to hear, because for many of us, that is just not our reality. There are a lot of writers out there who dream of writing, and are good at it and have a gift for it, but they're doing it within the confines of, raising small children or working several jobs to keep a roof over their head, and I firmly believe that, the literature is poorer when you don't have the voices of working class writers, people of color, queer folk. And so I guess one thing I would say to someone toiling away out there is, you're on your own timeline. And it can be really easy. I know this because I thought about giving up on this book so many times. I mean, I was 53 when my debut novel came out, and I can't tell you how often I thought of giving up, for practical reasons too. I mean, like, we really needed the money. Raising a kid in the city. But every time I thought about giving up on this project, it just broke my heart to think about abandoning these characters. And that was the thing that really kept me coming back. But I had to set it aside for long periods of time, sometimes months, while I was just, earning a living, being a mate, being a mom, And so, I guess I would say, to have that kind of literature from a lot of different voices, for a lot of us, that means not getting our first book deal when we're 29 or 30. And it can be so easy. You hit 35, no book deal. And in my case, like, no book deal, no book. I mean, it wasn't that I didn't get a book deal because people were picking on me. I didn't get a book deal because I hadn't finished my book. And then you hit 40, no book. You hit 45. And it's really easy to, tell yourself that, that it's time to just set it all aside and get on with, other things. Corrine Shepherd actually, in a lot of ways, sort of sprang from that frustration. She was a really minor character until about 6 drafts into the book. She didn't have a point of view. She was just going to be this pithy old lady, who stepped across the street, and delivered news that would further my plot, And I really started sort of meditating on the nature of a character who felt like, she had made all of the big decisions she was going to make in the world. And it was just time to sort of set things aside, and so I don't, is that advice? I don't even know if there was any advice in there.
That is great advice. And I'm so glad to hear it. And I would never have asked your age, but I'm so glad you mentioned it, because as someone who reviews books, I mean, I'm really tired of all the excitement that is lavished on 23-year-old brilliant novelists. It's nice to hear somebody work for years, maybe even decades on a book and find the kind of success that you have found. It's just really encouraging to all of us, no matter what our trade or our crafts are. And by the way, you went to the best writing program in the world. We should mention this is the Iowa Writers Workshop. Also want to mention that your book is just out in paperback, right?
Yep, it's right. Oh, here it is. It's got a sticky on it. Hang on.
Yes. Yep. So if you're in a book club that likes to wait for the paperback, the time is now.
Yep. And a little less expensive than the hardbound. So
exactly. I'm going to go to the questions now. So if you have a question, please just drop it in this box here, and I'll get it here. I had both listened to your gorgeous book and then read it. That's interesting. We should talk about the audiobook. And one thing that fascinated me was your choice of the point of view, and that Mary Rose tells her story in the first person. And then I was fascinated by the use of the first person plural at the end of the book. On audio, I just went with it, but on the page, I saw it. Mm-hmm. My question is, was this something you were conscious of? I bet you were, but did it come to you organically, or did it change as you worked through the drafts?
So point of view and tense are things that I play around with endlessly. I almost never complete a draft of a short story without having stopped a couple of times and switched up the point of view, just to see how it feels. And part of that's just a habit I've gotten into. But the other part of that is I make almost all of my decisions based on sound. You know,
What do you mean?
I mean, I read aloud constantly, you'll never see me working in a coffee house ever, I read aloud constantly, and I'm always listening to kind of the musicality, the voice of the story, and that's how I make almost all of my decisions. So Mary Rose's first person point of view was, I could never make her story work in any other point of view. So I had to keep it. And I was aware, when you have a book that's really not a very long book, 320 pages, and you have 7 points of view, 3 of them, there are 7, and 3 of them are from characters who never again they get this one chapter. This is their one moment to step forward and sing, right? And then that's it, and so I knew I was asking a lot of readers already. And so I actually wanted to put Mary Rose's point of view in third person, just for that tiny bit of consistency. Yeah. But it just didn't work, so yeah. And then the final chapter with the first person plural, I was really enamored of the idea of these waitresses, and this sort of collective voice. Particularly, again, I was interested in, how women support each other. And I was thinking a lot of the whisper networks that, you heard a lot about in the Me Too movement, and how that plays out for waitresses, right? There's a wonderful moment in that chapter where they're sort of giving Carla kind of the lowdown on which customers to avoid, right? And which don't mean anything by it, right? And which are the ones that you don't want to be alone with, and so I loved the kind of collective voice there. So
yeah, it's very effective, very haunting, and as you say, thematically connected to the whole book. Someone wants to know, I think you said the Iowa Review, but could you remind us where that short story appeared?
Shelter in Place. It's in the Iowa Review. I think it's from just a couple of years ago. So yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And actually I've got another one coming out in a new literary journal called Ground. And that's actually an old chapter from the book as well that I turned into a short story. So, I mean, it's as a, on a logical sort of, in a lot of ways, I understood that I wanted to hand the book off to women and girls, and that was absolutely the thing to do. But as a writer who really fights for every word, just incredibly slow. It really broke my heart to what I thought were incredibly beautiful chapters. So I kind of repurposed them as short stories. So
I'm so glad, and it's a reminder of the essential role that these little literary magazines fulfill in our literary culture.
Absolutely.
So they also need your support, by the way.
Yeah. Boy, no kidding.
Yeah. The audiobook. I mean, one of that first question, I think it was Martha Burns, mentions the audiobook. Did you do it? Can you tell us anything about it?
No, I did not. They had Cassandra Campbell and Jenna Lamia, I think that's how you say her last name, do the recordings. I don't think it was ever a real possibility that I would do my own book, in part because I have no experience at all, and so I'm going to be honest, I have not listened to it yet. In part because I'm not an audiobook person, and I never have been. But I have heard through the grapevine that it is absolutely beautiful. So, just beautifully read. So.
Excellent. You know that audiobooks are the fastest growing segment of the market now for like 10 years. It's just double digits.
Maybe it's just because I'm old and cranky, but I don't read on a Kindle either. And I really tried, especially when I was going to on trips and things where, you could put like 10 books on a Kindle or 50 or 100, and instead I pack them all in my suitcase every time. Yeah. So I love having a book in my hands. So they smell,
I'm always writing in them, so I have to have the book itself. Someone wants to know a little bit more about what you mean what do you mean when you say a character talks to you? I mean, it's your character. How could the character be talking to you?
Yeah. So I was on a panel for the Tucson Festival of Books last weekend. And one of the things I got to do was sit in on a lot of other panels.
Oh, nice.
And I was struck by something that the poet Eduardo Corral said. He talked about the importance of moving through the world with a sense of wonder and being attentive, right, to everything you hear and see. And so when I say, I kind of listen to the voices, I mean, as much as anything else, I mean, I try to get just very, very quiet, and think about these characters and sort of, and I mind a lot of, I mean, all of these characters had their beginnings in the voices of women and girls I knew growing up. And of course, very quickly imagination kicks in, almost immediately, right? But I could point to all of these characters and think about the real women that I had in mind when I began those characters. And in a lot of ways, I mean, insofar as the book is a Valentine, it's a Valentine to those women and girls I knew growing up, who were so incredibly tough and and whose lives I could not see in their totality as a little girl, so yeah.
Any film or TV future for this book?
Well, I don't know, but it's been optioned by HBO. Jen Sure is going to be the showrunner. She did a couple of episodes for My Brilliant Friend, which I loved, and she's going to be working with Selma Hayek. So and they've made the announcement that they've done the press release, so it's a real thing. But I don't know where it'll go from here. But I'm very hopeful. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it will be its own thing, but it will also be great if it's based on this book. Well, Elizabeth, this has just been such a treat for me to talk to you and to celebrate this your novel, which is so moving and so profound and so exciting at the same time. I just wish you more continued success. I guess I want to ask, although I know it's obnoxious, when's your next book? You're not gonna make us wait another 14 years, are you?
Well, I'm hoping to persuade someone to pick up a couple of collections of stories, because I worked on a lot of stories during the time I was working on Valentine and put together a couple of collections. And I have, I mean, I'm not gonna BS you. I mean, this has been a hard year for my family, and a big year in a lot of ways. And so I have journaled a lot and thought a lot of the next book. There are a couple of characters from Valentine I don't feel quite done with. And I'm thinking about it, but to say that I had really made a lot of inroads into a new book would be untrue. What I have done is I've survived beautifully so far and helped a 16-year-old boy make his way through this, and been a friend, tried to be a friend, and tried to come out of this last year as a better human being.
That's a lot.
Hopefully. Hopefully we all do.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. And thanks to the people at Books and Books. And I'm not sure if someone's going to. Yes, there they are. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Of course. So I just wanted to say, you were talking earlier about humility. And I think if this year has brought anything to all of us, it's the humility of, that we're all on the same, the same playing field. It's like, we've got to be humble because we're all facing the same exact threat. So I don't know. Anyway.
And at the same time, I think this has done such a, this has made it impossible to ignore, so many of the inequities, that, I mean, one of the things I was thinking about my hometown, there's a wonderful series out on the New York Times right now called Odessa. Actually, it's beautiful. And it's about Odessa High School. One of the things that's interesting about my hometown is that it generates an enormous amount of wealth, and almost all of it goes out of there. The people the Ector County Independent School District is the third worst school district in the state of Texas. So because that money flows out to the pockets of oil and gas people, right? It flows out to the pockets of the governor, right? But it does not flow. But the men and women who live there and work in those fields, are always clinging to the bottom of the middle class, the lower middle class, So when the pandemic hit for them, right, and everyone stopped driving, it was absolutely catastrophic. They had not only the pandemic, right, but also the entire economy collapsed in May. So I think of how much worse the pandemic has been for communities of color here in Chicago. So I'm so hopeful that that this sticks, right? That we don't. I don't want to go back to normal, right?
Right.
No, that's such a good point. That is such a good point, because I think it's also made us essentialize
Right.
what truly is important,
Right.
and I love that. And I love the fact that we've been able to have these conversations as well, because although you don't have the lovely feeling of an in-person event, you have an intimacy.
Right.
That is,
It's
Right.
because of places like Books and Books. Yeah, I think it's remarkable the way bookstores have responded to this. It's wonderful.
and because of people like you both, and your work, because of your toil and your labor, and because of all the time that you have put into creating a work, and you, Ron, because of all the books that you read and review, and we keep sending that message home that it is so important, that books are so important, and these stories are so important.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank you both so much for joining us in our little virtual bookshop.
It was a pleasure.
I want to remind everyone watching everywhere that you can just press that green button at the bottom of the screen. We will ship this book out to you. If you're in Miami and you want to pass by one of our stores, there's curbside pickup. And there's also, you could just pass by one of the stores for some safe, socially distanced shopping and browsing. And I hope that we will see you both in person soon.
I hope so too.
Maybe at Miami Book Fair.
That'd be great.
Later in November.
Thank you.
Great. All right.
Thank you both so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. And good night, everyone.
Good
Stay
night.
safe.